Howdy again everyone. In the past few years there's been a bit of a trend for manufacturers to take their macro lenses a step beyond by taking them beyond 1:1 magnification, particularly low budget manufacturers, and now Pergear are throwing their hat into the ring with a new 100mm f2.8 macro 2x lens. Its focal length of 100mm is about average for a macro, getting you good subject pictures, but more importantly, getting you a decent amount of space to work with when doing macro photography, and getting your backgrounds a little more compressed, which are helpful for more dedicated and experienced macro photographers. Still though, 100mm is long enough to require the use of a tripod for best results. It's a totally manual lens, and it'll be available on Sony E, Canon RF, Canon EF, Leica L, and Nikon Z mounts, and its price will be $319 US, making it potentially very good value. I'd like to thank Pergear very much for sending me a copy of this lens for testing, although, as usual, this is a totally independent review. The lens is fairly big and weighing nearly 2 pounds or about 800 grams, rather heavy. The lens is very tough and metallic, being built upon a metal mount without any weather sealing visible. At the rear there's a metallic aperture ring. The aperture stops are spaced out evenly and the ring turns smoothly and slightly heavily. The aperture mechanism has 13 blades to it. Then comes the metallic focus ring. The good news is that it turns extremely smoothly. The bad news is that its focus throw isn't very long, and thus it's not very precise to focus. Now, I didn't have too much trouble focusing at close distances, but at normal distances, for example, taking a portrait picture, the focus throw is so small that it's very difficult to get your subject properly sharp. So this difficulty will mean that this is not a lens for beginner photographers at all, only ones with a bit of experience focusing manually, and even then, only for those with a bit of patience. I'm really surprised that Pergear's designers didn't notice this problem. I should also mention that the markings on the barrel didn't seem quite right. The 2:1 macro ratio marking on the end was correct, but if you set it to a 1:1 macro ratio, it's actually not quite focusing as closely as that. Oh, and the lens does successfully focus to infinity as well as macro distances. I tested that carefully. For anyone interested, and as usual for a macro lens, this thing suffers from heavy focus breathing, zooming way in as you focus more closely to your subject, which can make focusing close up a little tricky, although as I say, this is normal for virtually all macro lenses. And as I mentioned already, this lens is totally manual, so no autofocus, no camera controlled aperture. The lens has a 67mm front filter size. The front has a bayonet mounting for a hood, but my copy didn't come with one, and the lens does not feature screw points for macro light either. Overall, while the lens's build quality is very tough, its biggest issue is that tricky focus ring, which really did need a far longer throw to it, especially for work at normal distances. Okay, well, let's take a look at image quality now by testing it on a Sony A7R III with its 42MP full frame sensor. No in-camera corrections are available on this lens. At f2.8 in the middle of the image we see excellent sharpness but low contrast. Over in the corners, image quality is still very good. It's a little softer there, but actually we get more contrast than in the middle, an unusual phenomenon but not unheard of. Unfortunately, we also see some colour fringing in the corners. Anyway, stop down to f4 for some extra brightness in those corners, but no other real improvement. Back in the middle, contrast is looking better, but it's still quite low. f8 looks just as good in the middle, but strangely, the corners are actually looking softer now, and they look the same at f11 and f16. It's very unusual to see that kind of optical behaviour when stopping a lens down. Anyway, overall, this is a lens that's capable of good sharpness, even if that sharpness comes in and out a little, but its contrast is very low. In fact, it's one of the lowest contrast lenses I've tested outside of mirror lenses. Alright, well, let's see about close-up image quality. At f2.8, sharpness and contrast are just okay here. f4 sees a nice improvement, although contrast still isn't very high. However, stop down to f5.6 for the best image quality. Doesn't last for long though, because when you stop down as far as f8, softness begins to re-emerge, this time from the effects of diffraction, which kick in at brighter apertures when you're shooting so closely to your subject. Here's f11 and f16, where you can see diffraction setting in too heavy to really make a useful image. Let's look at distortion and vignetting now. The lens projects some pincushion distortion here, but at f2.8 and f4, vignetting is only light. Stop down to f5.6 for those image corners to become fully bright. Something else I should mention though is that, when shooting at a 2:1 macro ratio, there is just an edge of physical vignetting right in the very corners of your images. Also discouraging is this lens's work against bright light, which is simply disastrous. As you can see, the lens picks up all kinds of flaring and glaring and loses contrast very easily. Stop down to f4 or f5.6 if you like, but it makes precious little difference, which is annoying as the lens's contrast is low enough as it is. Anyway, let's see about the quality of this lens's bokeh. It's a strong point. Not only does the lens offer quite deeply out of focus backgrounds here, but they look gorgeously soft as well, even in difficult transitional zones. Nice. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. The lens scores a major unexpected win here, as it appears to be apochromatic. No longitudinal chromatic aberration to be seen at all, even at f2.8. Even Canon and Nikon's expensive macro lenses can't achieve this. Well done, Pergear. So the lens does at least have a couple of redeeming qualities. Overall though, this optic is functional, but suffers from a lot of quirks and compromises. The lens's most serious issues were its fiddly manual focus ring, which made life difficult, and optically, the lens's very low contrast and huge problems with flaring means that you'll end up adding a lot of extra contrast in editing. It's not quite as sharp as other options on the market either, so I can't quite recommend this one. Wow, what a crazy lens that was! I'd love to hear from anyone who buys this thing and how they found it. Leave a comment in the section below, and if you found this review helpful and regularly watch my videos, then check out my Patreon page in the description below, where supporters get all kinds of exclusive bonus content as well as early access to all kinds of reviews. Ciao for now, everyone!